Thank you, Charlie. As Charlie said, I currently work with an organization that is focusing on pornography addiction, and the organization I work with is all about collective impact, where they bring the other organizations that are in the anti-porn movement together and push that energy forward and figure out common measurements, common goals to make it so that they're more effective. So one of the things that's really important, I don't know about you, but my parents didn't really have the right type of conversation with me about pornography and about healthy sexuality. And so we're trying to change that conversation and make it so that it's less taboo and more about a public health issue than about a moral issue. Because pornography, just like drugs, just like alcohol, it's an addiction. And so I want to break that addiction down in simple terms so that you can understand it a little bit more when you're going out there and interacting with that in the world, with public policy, with nonprofits that you're working with, so that you have a better conception to have the conversation that your parents didn't ever really have with you. So first, A leads to B and B leads to C. This is a progression of, if you increase one, it increases the others. With pornography addiction, there are 3 different elements that are connected that if you don't take care of the previous one, the next one will not be solved. So a lot of us focus on C, which is looking at pornography. I'm going to break down what B and A are so that you can know what it is we're actually really dealing with. Let's start with A. A is debilitating negative emotions. B is lust. And C is acting out, which one of the ways to act out is by viewing pornography. A, these debilitating negative emotions. A few examples of that are fear, anger, resentment, humiliation, depression, negativism, anxiety, guilt, remorse, loneliness, rage. You get the point. Okay? One that I want to focus on is shame. Shame versus guilt. Shame means I am bad. Guilt means I did something bad. If I am bad, that means I can't change myself because inherently I am bad. So when I do badly on a test, if I'm shaming myself about it, I'm saying to myself, you are bad. You are worthless because you can't get a good grade on this test. The person sitting next to me is a better person than I am because I am not good enough. That's what shame is. Guilt is, dang it, I didn't study enough, or this is something that I really don't do well at. I can choose to do something better in the future. A lot of our society nowadays has a shaming energy around it. That shame is breeding the need to seek outside of themselves to make themselves feel better about themselves. So I go through that test, I take that test, I fail it, or I get an 89 instead of a 90, and I'm really worried about that, right? Depends on where you're at, right? But I shame myself about that. Well, I go out and I'm going to eat a bunch of ice cream because that makes me feel better. Yes, occasionally that's appropriate because you're frustrated, you just failed a test. But if you eat ice cream enough that you are dependent on ice cream to make you feel like you're okay, to make you feel like you're an okay person, that's when debilitating negative emotions is driving an addiction. That's when you're saying, my external surroundings need to make me feel better. I'm not pulling that from within. So that's what A is. And A leads to lust. And lust is the ways that I find that external validation when I reach out to make myself feel better. Another way to understand this is that a pornography addiction or a lust addiction is often also categorized with fantasy, relationship, and connection addictions. So a lot of times people think that it's just that a nasty person who looks at these nasty images or just some child molester or whatever, right? But what it really comes down to is this is a person who's feeling bad about themselves and they're trying to find a fantasy way to connect with something that makes them feel like they're okay. And that is when they're acting in, not necessarily acting out, is if it's lust and not the actual acting out. See, the acting out is when I actually go outside and find an external source. Lust can often happen being dry, but not necessarily sober. So when you're going through the motions, or specifically somebody who has a sexual addiction with pornography and lust, They can be looking at somebody walking down the street, and they can be acting in with that person walking down the street, or a car even. It doesn't have to be a person, it can be an object, where it's, if going into fantasy around it, that, oh, if I had that car, or oh, if that woman thought I was cute, or oh, if that man would just, give me one of those smiles. And they get a hit off of it, and they feel like, okay, I'm acceptable, I'm an okay person now, because that external thing gave me that lust hit. Well, enough lust hit makes you desensitized, like that ice cream does, right? Once you eat so much ice cream, it loses its flavor. So you need more in it, and you need more to satiate that lust addiction. And that's when it goes to acting out. And acting out is anything that you do externally that's not the internal acting out. And that's looking at pornography, going to get a prostitute, whatever it is that feeds that addiction, because pornography is a progressive addiction. And so it starts with these negative, debilitating emotions, feeds into lust, and then feeds into acting out with pornography and other drugs of choice, which is what a terminology for that is. So if you think about it, alcoholism is something that I said we need to look at pornography just like we look at alcoholism. And alcoholism, you can't say, oh, well, I just drink beer. I don't do any of the other things. So it's just a little problem because I just drink beer, right? If you're an alcoholic, any kind of alcohol is feeding your alcoholism. And so a lot of people think, oh, well, every once in a while I just look at porn. It's not a big deal. It's just a little problem. When the reality is that anything that you do to lust, or any time you don't take care of those negative, debilitating emotions, you are feeding that addiction, and you're in an addiction. And so somebody can go for years without looking at porn or going and acting out, but they're really having this addiction still churning in them. And so it's not about whether they have moral issues or whether they're spiritually connected or they think it's good or bad. It's about whether or not they know how to deal with the B and the A to healthfully interact with their surroundings. The other thing that's really important to know about this is that it breeds objectification. So if I'm looking at other things to make me feel better about myself, then I'm looking at other things as objects or other people as objects. And it is clinically proven that people who have addictions to pornography do not have the ability to connect with real people in intimately healthy relationships, because the people in their lives turn into objectified objects that the person is selfishly feeding off of to make themselves feel better. Which it's really hard to be in a relationship like that, because then you find out, oh, well, if you're a wife, oh, I find out my husband has an addiction to pornography, and despite what he might say at the beginning, he's been objectifying that wife. And so it's hard because she's become an object in that relationship. And understanding that objectification and where it's coming from is really important as we move forward and talk about this as a public health issue instead of a moral issue. I also think it's really important that when we are talking about it amongst ourselves, that we are not including it in vocabulary that breeds shame. Like I said with my parents, they didn't really know how to do that. Our generation was raised on a shame-filled description of pornography and sexuality. And I think it's really important that we change the way that we talk about it. That we're not talking about these people as bad people. These are good people. 70% of men and 30% of women. That's the research statistics right now. And that's of the surveyed population of the United States that actually admit that they struggle with it and categorize it as that. So I mean that's a really strong statistic for an issue that is so pervasive for us to not understand it, to not be able to talk about it with each other, to not shame it. So let's talk about it as a public health issue. Let's change our language about that as we teach the next generation and as we learn ourselves about what the real issue is. Thank you. I want to acknowledge the ABCs of pornography addiction. Andrew P. is his pen name. He's the one who has a fabulous article if you want to look it up. That's the website to learn more about this. I'd love to take any questions if you have any about this issue. Thank you. Right.
Is that the terminology in the research that they use?
Yes, depends on whether you're talking about research, published research, or whether you're talking about the organizations that are in this movement. So like I mentioned, the list right now that we have is inclusive nationally is about 372, I think last time I looked at it, of different organizations that are in the anti-porn movement, like different nonprofits that are working towards this. So that would be the word that those organizations on the whole would use, is the list.
Okay, but it's not the word in peer-reviewed research.
They do reference the list. It's dependent on which research article and how it is, because it is a fresher, newer movement of changing it to be clinically proven that it is an addiction, and a lot of people have done it on both sides, right? So that it's something that's starting to be more popular. So the language around it isn't quite uniformed yet, which is why I'm having a hard time answering that question. But yes, both yes and no, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Any other questions? Charlie?
What are some healthy conversation starters to have with your children with this topic?
That's an awesome question. So one thing that's really healthy is helping them recognize objectification, because that's something, I mean, this is a huge issue, right? And it can be very overwhelming. I have a little boy and one on the way, and it's like, okay, so how do I talk about this? And one thing is showing them, this is an organization using a woman's body to sell something. Is that recognizing that she has likes and dislikes and has a name and, just something simple for a child? And no, that's using her as an object. Do people like to be used as objects? No, let's talk about how that's right and wrong, how that makes people feel, and just teaching them about objectification, and so that they don't think that that's something that's okay, because it's very prevalent in our society right now. It's a great question. Also, not using shame when you talk about their bodies. Specifically, I mean, my little boy, he's curious about his body. He's not even 2 years old yet, and he's learning the body parts, right? And so I know in my own family there was a taboo. You don't say anything that's even remotely something that could be inappropriate, right? And so I got that energy from my mom, and I don't want to pass that on to my kid. So I can teach him his body parts using the correct terminology in not a negative way, and I can teach him what's appropriate about that. And it's that negative shaming energy of, oh, this is bad, that we need to rewrite how we're interacting with our kids, because we have so much fear around it. That comes across. And so learning is, the education piece is really important. Great question. Anything else? Yes?
I think one of the fears that people have is that by teaching them about it, especially children, by teaching them about it, probably it will be a way of encouraging them to go in and look at it. What do you say about that?
That's actually one of the major comments that we get in anytime we present is, well, it'll create curiosity. I'll tell you that you go into any elementary school, and the curiosity is already created. That they're already having conversations with their peers. They're already looking at things. They're surrounded by it. You walk down the aisle at a grocery store to check out, and you've got magazines that are soft porn. And so I would rather have that conversation with my kid than have somebody else's child who doesn't know how to have a healthy conversation be the one who introduces that topic. I also think that curiosity is not necessarily bad. It's what you choose to do and how you choose to learn about that curiosity. And if you create a healthy environment where your child can come to you and say, Mom, I found this thing and I'm curious about it, you can talk through it. How did that make you feel? This is what happens if you keep looking at those types of things and have an open, healthy conversation about it. Then that usually takes that curiosity and channels it into positive change, instead of, oh, there's this negative energy and Mom doesn't want to talk about it or Dad doesn't want to talk about it, and so I'm not going to go to them, I'm just going to be curious off on the side. And that secrecy is what's breeding that shame, and that's what's breeding the addiction in the first place. And so it's a very valid concern, and in our society today, I don't think that we can shield our children. We need to teach them. I think that's my time. So thank you so much for letting me come and present, and I hope that this was helpful.